Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
The weather affects all of us, and better forecasting can be essential to protecting lives and property. Satellites have vastly improved weather forecasting, but how can businesses make the best use of that information? My guest on this episode of the Ex Terra Podcast is Thomas Cavett, VP of Strategy and Operations at Tomorrow.io. And Thomas, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom.
It's my pleasure. Let's just talk about the basics about Tomorrow.io and what it does.
Sure. So Tomorrow.io is a weather intelligence software company. We were founded in 2016 by a couple of Israeli veterans who had experience as pilots and in special operations, and they dealt with sort of the operational effects of weather in the military, and were in situations where the forecast really wasn't given to them in a way that helped them make the right decisions. They had friends who and themselves were in life-threatening situations and really wanted to change the way that weather information was delivered to them. There's a lot behind sort of this idea of weather intelligence. So when you think about kind of the weather value chain, there's really three main components, right? First is we have to observe the atmosphere, which means, either visually or with different types of sensors. Then we take that information and we use models to create different forecasts, right? We're looking at different atmospheric variables, different environmental variables, and we use different models to forecast different types of those. And then all of that's delivered in sort of an end product. Whether you and I consume weather information from a TV weatherman or an app on your phone. And our goal is really to innovate across that entire value chain as a company. And so we work with our companies like Uber, JetBlue, Ford, the NFL, everything from kind of insurance providers to restaurants, mining companies, et cetera. And behind all of that, we run our own proprietary weather models, which allows us to have a lot of flexibility, and we can ingest more data sets, more observations, really customize sort of the outputs for our customers. And then from an observational standpoint, we're building a constellation of satellites as well.
And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But currently, where do you get all that data to provide a proprietary forecasting model?
So we ingest, all of the sort of publicly available data sets that the government produces. And then we also buy different proprietary data sets around the world to fill gaps. But really, the space component of our business is meant to address this idea that really the entire industry is limited by inaccurate and unavailable data in certain parts of the world. And we're trying to solve that problem.
So then what is weather intelligence versus a weather report or forecast?
Yeah, so weather intelligence is really about rethinking the way we digest weather information, right? When I tell you a weather forecast and I give you, this is the relative humidity, the temperature, the wind speed, here's the chance of precipitation, that's all pretty abstract information, especially if you're not a meteorologist. And so you end up having to make a lot of very, subjective decisions about what you should do with that information, right? How is it going to impact you? And so what we really try to do is contextualize the weather forecast into something that's relevant, to your unique situation, your specific sort of thresholds of these different variables that you care about, delivering that information in the form of the decision that you want to make, right? So we kind of help the user skip that cognitive step when you're thinking about, all of those weather variables, what do I do with them? So some examples might be, if you're a trucking company, let's say, and you need to decide, do I tarp the product on my truck, or do I add extra load to the truck so it doesn't blow over because of the winds? If I'm an asphalt paving company, I need to know when it's going to rain or what the solar irradiance is going to be to know how long it's going to take to dry. Airlines look at de-icing fluid. When do I have sort of the ideal conditions? The winds are low enough speed that I can spray the de-icing fluid and it's not going to blow away. Railroads also think about crosswinds and derailment. So there's lots of different use cases that are very, sort of industry specific, but all based on kind of the same process.
You mentioned that a couple of your founders were pilots, and I've come out of the aviation industry myself, and the terminal forecast that you go and you'd look at in the pilot briefing room could be, let's say, gibberish if you don't know what
Sure.
you're reading. So how do you take all of that information and present it in such a way that the end user finds it useful?
Well, we do provide sort of, aviation specific, TAFs and things like that are, specifically in those languages that pilots speak. But it's often, really a more kind of operational user who's, not a meteorologist, not a PhD in atmospheric science. And it's translating into here's the decision. And now you can disseminate this to your entire organization. Do I, send the train down the tracks, or do I reroute the train? Very, very simple and kind of concise, almost sound bites of what you should do with that information.
When you make that information available, I don't want to say that you would be liable for someone else's decision, but what kind of protection do you have? Somebody gets your information, makes a decision, and then something goes sideways. How do you protect yourself from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we present the information, and what you do with it is up to you, right? We're not forcing any sort of decision. And the reality is, forecasting the weather is not a precise science, right? You're never going to be 100% accurate all the time in every location. And so our users understand that. And so we give them sort of, here's the probability that this is going to happen. Now you have to make your own sort of risk decision.
And I guess maybe it will help out with the reputation of some television meteorologists, where a lot of them have said, boy, I sure wish I could be wrong 75% of the time and keep my job.
Exactly.
Give us a little bit about your background, Thomas. How did you get into this?
Yeah, so I took a pretty, circuitous path to get into space and the weather industry. After college, I was in the Army. I was a Green Beret, spent most of my time in the Pacific region doing mostly counterterrorism related work. After that, I went to business school. So I went to Wharton. I got an MBA and also a master's in international studies from a program called the Lauder Institute. And while I was in grad school, I actually co-founded my own startup. We were working on building a wearable device that could detect when you were injured and then attempt to sort of automatically notify rescue personnel that you needed help. And we were sort of thinking about, high risk, austere environments where people might be incapacitated and couldn't call for help on their own. Unfortunately, that business didn't work out. And then I ended up landing at McKinsey, where I worked across a lot of different industries in consulting. And, that kind of gave me this jack of all trades sort of skill set. And I met the Tomorrow IO, or one of the Tomorrow IO founders. Back then it was actually called Climacell. And we would talk every few months, and he came to me and he said, hey, we're building this space program. It's not public yet, but I need someone who can come in and kind of help build that piece of the business. And I live in Denver. I was kind of excited about getting into the space industry. And so it was a really, kind of fortuitous opportunity to jump into this space.
What attracted you to the space industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one, it's, there's sort of a nexus of the industry growing here in Denver, and I know I don't want to leave Denver because I like it here, but it's also just exciting to me. I think, the idea of, using different types of technologies to kind of make life better here on Earth is really attractive to me. And I like the idea of, really disrupting an industry that has been more or less the same for, over a century. And so that really excited me.
Weather obviously is something that affects everybody. I mean, you can't go outside, and one way or the other, the weather is going to affect you. And governments spend billions of dollars on weather observation, research, and analysis. So how do private companies like yours differ from the government efforts, and how do they offer advantages?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is that we can take bigger risks, right? We can do it in a faster and kind of more agile way than the government. Specifically when it comes to space, right? We're seeing, cheaper, faster systems being deployed that offer the same or better data quality, coming out of these kind of commercially launched and operated weather systems specifically. And, it benefits both private industry and the government, right? We're no longer sort of dependent on the government for a market. There's a commercial market that's grown and demand for these services. And, we're building not just space observing systems, right? There are niche sort of modeling systems and forecasting systems that are coming online. we're leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning, really kind of pushing the envelope in a space where, historically the government did the entire value chain end to end when it comes to weather. The other thing is, I think the government is realizing that this older sort of $1 billion acquisition model is kind of outdated, right? They've been building, these one-off spacecraft, which admittedly have really pushed the science forward significantly, and we wouldn't be here without those programs. But it takes 10 or more years to develop these systems, and then they're sort of outdated by the time they're even on orbit. So we can just move faster, I think, is the biggest thing.
How does the end user access your data?
So it depends on who the user is, right? If you're a government modeling agency, you can ingest, almost level 0 data from a spacecraft. But if you're a consumer like you and I, then you need it sort of translated into that idea of weather intelligence. So it kind of depends on where in the value chain you sit, and we can offer sort of all of those options.
Is there a service people can subscribe to, or come down to that kind of granular level with me?
Yeah, so we, primarily we serve commercial customers, and we have our software platform, but we also do have a consumer app that you could download on your phone, which is, serviced by the same data.
I'm talking with Thomas Cavett, VP of Strategy and Operations at Tomorrow IO on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click on subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Now, you said, it's said that climate is what you expect and weather is what you find, which is pretty true. Tomorrow IO is working in both arenas. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I spend quite a bit of my time on Capitol Hill advocating for weather and space and climate policy. And, the science behind climate modeling is obviously very different than weather modeling, right? They're sort of fundamentally different outputs, and the certainty of those models is different. But the way we think about it is, weather is the manifestation of climate, right? To your point, right? And, climate tells us these sort of longer term trends of what the weather will do. But I think separating the two in some ways causes problems for how we think about not just long-term, but short-term kind of climate solutions. Too often people are looking at these sort of decadal risk maps, and they said, this area is going to be underwater in 30 years, or this area is going to be on fire in 30 years. That's really not very actionable for the majority of the world, right? You've got, sort of at-risk communities. They can't just sort of change their investment strategy like a major corporation. They can't sell their home or move their small business or whatever it might be. And so what we see is there's a need for tools to make better decisions about the weather that's happening as a result of climate change, and how this is going to impact them tomorrow, right? No pun intended. And Tomorrow doesn't do climate science. We do bring some climate data into our platform, but we're really focused on that kind of climate adaptation piece of the puzzle, right? And so our constellation will also improve, not just weather information, but climate information, right? The observation of the atmosphere and the weather itself is how we sort of inform all of those climate models too. So it is tied together, I think, more closely than people often discuss.
I recall, and you may not be old enough, but back in, I think it was 1976, a headline in Newsweek magazine, I believe it was, that warned of a coming ice age. And now, of course, everything focusing on climate change deals with, mostly with global warming. Right. What kinds of things are you seeing in that arena that perhaps the services that you're providing can provide a little clarity to?
Yeah, well, so we focus essentially on 14 days out. Beyond 14 days, you really can't forecast the weather. And, most people, if they tell you that they can, they're probably selling you snake oil. And so what we're focused on is, with our constellation, especially observing the atmosphere on a more frequent and global scale allows us to better predict in that time frame. And so whether the climate is warming or cooling or whatever it might be, we are seeing more volatile extreme weather, right? Sort of regardless of the longer term trend. And that's really where we're focused.
You announced in 2021 that you'll be launching your own constellation of satellites. You've alluded to that a couple of times during this interview. So let's talk about that a little bit more in depth. Tell us about the constellation that you're working on and how that's going to improve the services that you offer.
Yeah, so massively. So we launched announced about 2 years ago that we're launching radars, precipitation radars, which will be the first commercially built and operated radars in space. And then about a year ago, we also added microwave sounders to that mix. And so a lot of people ask us, you're a software company. Why are you, taking this crazy risk of putting something in space when you've already got this sort of viable commercial customer base? And the answer is we really worked backwards from what's the problem we're not able to solve? What's sort of the biggest limiting factor within the industry? And it is those observations, particularly in developing parts of the world or over the oceans. In the US, we have NEXRAD, which is a ground-based radar network. It's quite comprehensive. And Western Europe has something similar, and Japan. But as soon as you get outside of that bubble, that's almost non-existent. And so the reality is essentially 5 billion people or so live outside of radar coverage. And that's the backbone of really our weather infrastructure. And so we said, okay, we're going to sort of, take this risk, launch this constellation. And today there's one radar in space. It's called the Global Precipitation Monitoring Mission, built by NASA and JAXA. It's in extended operations as a single satellite in LEO, or in low Earth orbit. That provides roughly a 3 to 4 day revisit rate. So it's really built for science, right? If it happens to fly over a storm, you're lucky. You get a lot of data and insights into that specific storm, but it's not useful for operational meteorology when you're running a model every few minutes or hours, right? And so what we realized we needed to decrease that revisit rate drastically. And with our 2 spacecraft, we'll have a total of about 30 spacecraft in our constellation. We're going to decrease that revisit rate down to hourly or less for the entire globe. So really a step change in data quality, both for weather and for climate science.
When you think about looking at particularly precipitation from space as opposed to a terrestrial radar, what are the advantages to looking at precipitation rates from space?
Yeah, so the fact that we're looking from space is really a function of we needed to find a more cost-effective and scalable way to get global coverage. If you wanted to build NEXRAD globally, that's billions, if not over $1 trillion in infrastructure, and it would take many years, right? And then the ongoing sort of maintenance costs are very expensive. Now there are some advantages from the perspective of you can't build that type of system over the ocean. Coastal regions are more difficult to build over. In mountainous regions, we have pretty limited coverage because of just the topography. And so space allows you to cover those areas. But really, it's just a more sort of cost-effective and scalable way to get a higher revisit rate, higher temporal and spatial resolution when we observe the atmosphere.
I want to go back and talk about the line of software and services for just a minute. Are those lines more industry dependent, or are they application dependent? Is it more about how you access the data, or is it about who is accessing the data?
Yeah, I think it's about who. So we have always invested in a single product and tried to make it as sort of broadly applicable as possible, which is different than what you see in most of the rest of the industry. Most of the industry will have, here's our agriculture product, here's our aviation product, here's our, whatever the other industry might be. But by building just one platform for all of these users, it really allows us to go deep and invest in a lot of capabilities for it. And what it comes down to is really kind of those thresholds of different weather variables, right? Like you might care about wind speed and temperature and humidity, whereas another customer might care about, solar irradiance and cloud cover, right? And building sort of this logic-based tool that says, here are my thresholds, here's the decision I want to make. And now every single time those conditions are met in the next, 14 days, we're going to tell you, and we're going to, give you that heads up that here are the operational decisions you have to make. And so it makes it kind of industry agnostic in many ways.
When you talk about your satellites, we've got a little bit of time here that I can dig into this a little bit more. Are we talking about CubeSat size, microsat size? Where are you looking at as far as the actual spacecraft?
Yeah, so it's funny when we launched our program, 2 years ago or slightly before that, our initial pitch deck was a Nike shoebox, and we said, this is what we're going to build. It's grown significantly from there. So our two Pathfinders, we're actually launching the first Pathfinder radar at the end of this month, which is pretty exciting. Those are, ESPA class, ESPA class satellites that are, about 100 kilograms. Our operational radar is quite larger. Let's say, about 300 or so kilograms. And then our microwave sounders are CubeSats, but they're, a little bit bigger than sort of the average microwave sounder CubeSat. So
how has that technology advanced over the past several years? You talked about some of the purpose-built satellites that have been put up. And I know that with miniaturization and the improvements in processing speed and things of that nature, what kinds of improvements have you seen in the not only the radar technology, but the microwave technology that are allowing you to get down into this granular level of data?
Yeah, well, specifically with radars, so GPM is the satellite I mentioned before. That's this, $1 billion school bus. It's quite large.
Right.
I think it weighs close to a ton. And NASA also had a spacecraft called RainCube, which was a much smaller form factor, but able to produce the same, Ka-band precipitation data. But the problem with that program was the swath width. So the area coverage on the ground of RainCube was only a few kilometers. And so in order to turn it into something operational, you would need to launch thousands of them, right, to get the right revisit rate. So the areas that we really focused on is one, we actually acquired a company called Remote Sensing Solutions, who builds radars for NOAA's Hurricane Hunter aircraft. They have a very unique software-defined pulse-to-pulse reconfigurable radar backend solution. So that's sort of the brains behind the radar. And then the other sort of part of the equation is really the antenna itself. So, sort of how we expand the swath width to get really large coverage over the Earth. And all of those things, the cost of all of those components has come down significantly in the last few years. On the sounder side, so we're actually leveraging Tropics, which is a NASA-funded program. They've launched, one of those already and shown quite promising data results. And so we're really just commercializing that, making it a bit more robust and kind of building on those capabilities.
When you make your business case, how do you talk with potential customers, potential end users about what it is that you are doing as opposed to what they can get elsewhere?
Yeah, well, so the what they get elsewhere is typically free in many cases, right? They're getting National Weather Service and NOAA forecasts. But the problem is what NOAA builds is really kind of a one-size-fits-all solution, right? It's not customized for that unique sort of industry needs for the most part. And they're slower, right? They can't necessarily innovate on all of the different sort of cutting edge technologies that we can leverage, whether that's cloud computing, whether that's artificial intelligence and machine learning to, bias correct various models. And we're able to just do that on a much faster, time scale. And that makes us more accurate, frankly, right? That's kind of what it comes down to is accuracy, but then also, giving it to you in that sort of weather intelligence format to make better decisions, which, the National Weather Service might say, here's a storm warning for this, enormous area, this county or part of the state. What they need is, what about these few city blocks, right? What do I actually do here and for this specific location, which we can provide?
We're just about out of time, Thomas, but I want to ask you the same question that we put to all of our guests, and that's to look out the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce and tell me what you see.
That's a great question. So, we've seen in the previous 10 years, kind of an order of magnitude increase in, investors and in kind of the amount of private capital that's flowing into commercial space, right? And simultaneously, an order of magnitude decrease in the costs of building space assets and getting them into space, right? And that's been, particularly, in launch, but also on the satellite side of the industry, right? I think, there are a lot of incredible concepts coming out, like, propulsion systems and, platforms to provide raw materials in space and sort of getting us from space 2.0 to 3.0. But I do think that there's still a lot of inefficiency of capital. And I think there's still a lot of learning curve of sort of how the economics of this and what sort of business models are going to work. And the other thing I think that we as a sort of space community have to think about is, how do we better educate everyone that space can solve terrestrial problems, right? It's not just, we're not just exploring space for the sake of doing something cool and interesting, but, for us, especially, we're building this constellation to solve, weather challenges right here that affect us every day. Right. And so I think that's going to continue to be something that we have to sort of swim upstream and really, fight against. But I'm optimistic. I think we're seeing a lot of developments and, sort of how we can really build faster and cheaper and better. And, building on what the government sort of led science has done for us in the past, many decades. But I think industry is going to continue to take a much bigger role.
It was interesting. I was at a function last night talking about Ex Terra, and when I tell people that we're a multimedia company that focuses on space commerce, and a lot of them look at me and say, "Well, you mean like warehouse space?" I mean, there's so little,
Right.
there is so little actual perception about what space commerce is that I think you're quite right that we've got a lot of educating to do on the part of the general public.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing that I'll leave you with, since you're in the weather business, is that when I can get the NEXRAD data in my car like I could through the ADS-B in my airplane, I'll be a much happier driver. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of sort of connected car systems that are leveraging weather information from us. So it's coming.
I'll look forward to that. Thomas, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. It's great to speak with you.
Thomas Cavett is with Tomorrow IO. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click on subscribe so you don't miss an episode of the podcast or any of our other videos. You can also get daily space commerce news at xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter at xterrajsc. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers. My Galileo through his looking glass. Thirst for reason. Our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, know my view. Like finding water on the moon.